So, next we need to talk about what makes species themselves vulnerable to extinction. We talked about what makes extinctions more likely to occur in some habitats over others, but what makes some species more likely to go extinct relative to others? So, not all species have the same risk of extinction. You can't pick any two species randomly and expect them to go extinct at the same time necessarily. So there are many features that make species more vulnerable and have increased extinction risks. These are a few of those. So narrow geographic range. If the species is naturally rare, for example, there are some species that live not far from here that live in only one cave. That's where they evolved. That's where they currently live. They're automatically more vulnerable to extinction because they live in such a specific place and nowhere else. If there's only one or a few populations, so same idea as narrow geographic range, any species that lives only in Louisiana and nowhere else is going to have a higher risk of extinction than something that lives across the entire continental US. If it has small or declining population size, it's more likely to go extinct. If it is an island endemic, again, remember, endemic means that it lives somewhere and nowhere else. So that means if it only lives on islands, it's more likely to go extinct. It's particularly more likely to go extinct if it only lives on one island. Anything that is hunted or harvested by people is much more likely to go extinct. So these are some examples. The Tasmanian tiger went extinct in 1936 and the dodo went extinct in 1662. These were both island species, relatively small ranges, hunted or harvested by people, lived on islands, not very large population sizes. So very vulnerable to extinction, and they did go extinct. There are other features that also make species more vulnerable and have increased extinction risk. So if they have a large home range, meaning that they need more space in general, that means that smaller habitat patches are less likely to have everything they need or to support a population. If they have a large body size, think elephants, rhinos, much more likely to go extinct than a mouse. They have slow reproduction. Think, again, whales, elephants, rhinoceroses. This means that it takes them a long time to reach maturity. People would fall in that category, so it takes us, somewhere between 12 and 25 years for most humans to have their first baby. This is common in large mammals that only have one baby at a time. They often don't have more than one baby at a time, so their reproduction rate is very slow. They can't increase their population very rapidly. You might think the opposite is like some of the frogs I study can lay 10,000 eggs at one time. They might be reproductively mature in 1 or 2 years. You can imagine that the rate of increase for that frog could be extremely high if a lot of those offspring survived. Whereas if you thought about an elephant, the number of elephants, even if we had enough food to feed them all and their babies were well taken care of, they could never increase their population at the same rate that that frog that can have 10,000 eggs in one breeding season could. Limited dispersal ability. So if you can't move to a new habitat patch, if there's something wrong with your current habitat patch, you're more likely to go extinct. If you have seasonal migrations, that increases your risk of extinction because you depend on habitats in multiple different places having different resources. So think migratory birds. They need the right conditions in their wintering habitat and the right conditions in their summer habitat, and they may need the right conditions on stops along the way so that they have a place to rest on their way between their two different places where they live. Low genetic variation increases extinction risk. Specialized niche, if you remember what that means, if you can only eat one thing, or you can only live in a particular kind of tree, or you need a very specific water temperature, things like that are going to make you more likely to go extinct, because if one of those things changes, then you won't be able to survive. Low tolerance to disturbance increases extinction risk. If you need aggregation, so that means if you need to have a lot of individuals, and if you'll think back to the passenger pigeons, they had very, very large flocks, and they had safety in numbers originally, and that increased their risk of extinction, they think, because when their population sizes got too small, they just couldn't do all the things they would normally do as a species to survive. Also, no prior contact with humans. So any species that's evolved with humans and is used to pressures from humans is going to probably do better with extinction risk than if they've never encountered people before, which is a big problem with some of the island species. They evolved on islands where there weren't human predators, and then it was really easy for people to catch them. So, some types of species fall into groups that have several of these characteristics. So, predators are one, tend to have larger home ranges, larger body sizes, slower reproduction. Amphibians have very limited dispersal ability. Now, if you remember, I said they're the most threatened vertebrate order. Island endemics, I said this already, all go in with those ideas. So, problems with small populations is what we're going to talk about next. And there are some specific problems associated with small population size that increase extinction risk. And I'll go through and talk about each of these separately. So one is when you get smaller, you have less genetic diversity. So loss of alleles or heterozygosity due to genetic drift and or inbreeding. And we will talk about both of those. Demographic stochasticity, which is fluctuations in population size, age structure, or sex ratio due to random variations in individual birth and death rates. And environmental stochasticity, which is fluctuations in population size due to random variation in biotic and abiotic factors affecting birth and death rates of all individuals in a population in the same or similar fashion. So you can think about environmental stochasticity as like a storm coming through and causing a major problem for the whole population. So we're going to go through each of these in turn, and I will make a separate video for each one.